But what I think I've underestimated is how much you can achieve with healthy eating. And I'm in this research. If you look at diet, also studies that go into the actual extremes, societies that really stick to Mediterranean diet. If you look again at these Amerindians communities without heart disease, and I know that you can't 100% pin this down to diet, but I do think diet is a huge component of this. Yeah, for example, looking with the work that I'm doing, I found out, for example, that the life expectancy in Germany is now 3 years shorter than in Spain.
Imagine a future where chronic disease is rare and you're guaranteed 10 more years of healthy, vibrant life. This is a glimpse of health Dr. Jens Walter, a global leader in microbiome research, offers today. His groundbreaking NiME Diet trial, inspired by the ancestral gut microbiome, proved that massive health gains from cardiovascular protection to anticarcinogenic effects are entirely possible, even using affordable, pragmatic foods. But this future demands more than individual effort. Join us as Dr. Walter calls for a top-down reform to make this vision a reality. Jens Walter is a global leader in microbiome research and professor at University College Cork Ireland, where he directs a pioneering research group exploring the evolution and ecology of the human gut microbiome. His work reveals how diet, lifestyle, and microbial diversity shape human health and how modernity has disrupted our ancient symbiosis with these invisible ecosystems through groundbreaking studies like the non-industrialized microbiome restoration diet, NiME or NiME Diet trial. We'll go into that. Dr. Walter has shown how ancestral dietary patterns can reverse metabolic imbalances and restore harmony within the gut. Now collaborating with Dublin-based Gourmet Fuel, he's translating the science into daily life, bringing microbiome-supported meals to the public. Dr. Walter embodies really what we're doing here at the DNA of Things. Our mission is to illuminate how biology and behavior converge to activate human potential, and his journey bridges the science and story, showing that what we feed, that is our bodies, our microbes, and ideas, can transform our collective future. So Dr. Jens Walter, thank you so much for joining me today on the DNA of Things.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure.
You know, I have spoken with a lot of microbiome people, and I used to be one. My days at with Dr. Ruth Lay at Cornell, she really a pioneer, understudy coming out of Jeffrey Gordon's lab, and working with greats like Rob Knight, and so I really got to stand on the shoulders of giants, but that was coming up on 2 decades ago, where I was doing that work, or at least 15 years. And, as of late, I was having conversations with folks like, Dr. Sean Gibbons, who I think and others. And it is really exciting to see like the work we were doing and the ideas we were talking about 15 years ago are now actually starting to have an actual translation and integration, and not least of all with the work that you're doing in Dublin with a commercial partner. So as I mentioned, this NiME Diet trial, am I pronouncing that properly? First of all, NiME.
Oh yeah, we thought it's NiME.
Yeah, NiME.
Yeah, because we thought it's catchy. Yes.
It's catchy, and so I want to talk a little bit about how that's going, but I'd love to learn more about your journey, like what drew you into the microbial universe, so to speak, because that's always a fascinating story. So yeah, would love to know, what called you into this world, and certainly I want to bring to light some of the research that has gotten you, most excited today, and to learn more about the lab. But let's start at the beginning. What drew you into the microbial world?
So I majored in food science, Lebensmitteltechnologie in Hohenheim in Germany. And that was in the 90s, and this was when, probiotics and prebiotics started to become big. And as part of my education and also to learn English, I wanted to go to a English-speaking country. And a lab mate told me, there's this guy in New Zealand called Gerald Tannock, and he's really the pioneer, of microflora research, because that's what we called it in the day. Microbiome wasn't even around. And I wrote an email to Gerald Tannock, say, look, I come, I don't cost anything, can you please, employ me for 3 months? And he said, yeah, can come. And I still remember I arrived, and the first thing he told me, because I said, he asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, look, I'm really would like to work on pro and prebiotics. And the first thing he told me, I don't really believe in pro and prebiotics, but I really do microflora research. I like these communities. I like what they do. And I said, that works for me. So I started really more in the day. We worked on these molecular fingerprinting techniques, essentially, the primitive sequencing, that we did later and that you did in your studies. So, and that was really just, essentially ecology, who's actually there. And we worked with mice, and I really liked it. And then, got more and more really, into microbiota research, did a PhD again, I owned a PhD in Germany, continued to work 1 year in New Zealand with Gerald, and then did my postdoc with him, and got increasingly fascinated by more basic ecology, by basic evolutionary questions, how these microbes evolve. Very similar to, very inspired by Ruth Ley, actually, in the early day, her work on host specificity and, how microbiomes evolve with mammalian hosts. I did similar research, but more with a model species. And that really evolved more and more then into ecological studies, trying to understand the ecology of these communities and how can you actually modulate them, perhaps a bit more successful than with traditional probiotics. And that brought me then into nutrition, and into, more ecology and evolutionary based strategies to modulate microbiomes. Yeah. And funny enough, now being in Cork, and where I'm thinking more about translation, we are now actually starting to engineer foods. As a go, a step beyond NiME and actually engineer foods to make them more healthy and microbiome friendly. So to some degree, I'm actually going back to food science now. So it's a bit that the circle is kind of closing, which I kind of like.
Sorry, can you remind me again the professor you worked with in New Zealand? What was their name?
His name is Gerald Tannock.
Okay, Gerald Tannock. Okay.
Yeah.
Why have I not come across him?
He was even he was still working. I don't know. Yeah, he has some really, really nice work. He's still actually active. I still think he writes great papers. He had a very nice book in the day called Normal Microflora, I think. Yeah, and that is one of the reasons why my supervisor in Germany knew him and then recommended, so I should contact him. Yeah, so.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Well, so that's a full circle now insofar as back to food science. And well, why don't we jump into this NiME diet, right? Mm-hmm. Because it doesn't seem to me like it's a fad diet, right? And
I hope not.
Yeah. Well, that's what kind of struck me, and it has elements of, like, it could appeal to the fad diet type of craze, paleo, right? Or, this notion of eating how our ancestors ate. But I don't think that's what we really want, right? Because, that wasn't always good. There was a lot of starvation, and there was a lot of, trials.
I think there are certain characteristics of food,
sure,
that I think it's worth to think how that was throughout human evolution. And, definitely also in terms of, how we change these characteristics, in the modern world, through food processing, through
right.
the modern food system. But for example, it's I think you put the finger on the nuances. There is no such thing as an evolution or an ancestral human diet, actually. There were human communities working or living almost entirely on animal products. There were human communities living very bland rich. So I think I still like the idea to think about evolution. I think, but so I do think that Paelo do a lot right from a kind of philosophical standpoint or from a conceptual standpoint. I think just they do a lot of things wrong then also simply just by assuming there's this one ancestral diet. And also I think some focus areas are probably wrong, because it is really just not how ancestral humans ate.
Right. Well, so if we could like break it down for like to first principles to kind of help listeners who may be non-expert, I think about it this way, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is when I think about, well, it's human anthropology in a way, right? And culturally, how we had prepared food in the past. I mean, there's a huge like social component to it, certainly.
Mhm.
But if we think, before that, so here's a paradigm I want to try that I've played with for years, is this notion of like food is functional, food is social, and food can even be, entertainment in a way. And, at the end of the day, when we as humans or any animals, you kind of eat, and food, like you actually are storing, so you get energy immediately to do work, but you're also storing potential energy for the future. And so that's like functional. And so it depends on like what you want to do. You might choose different kinds of food. So we can talk about athletes in a minute here. Like an endurance athlete is going to eat differently than a weightlifter, for example. So that's like, or for health issues, I mean, we're going to eat differently, functional foods, let's say, and we could dig into that. And then, on the social side, it, just, kind of sharing and breaking bread together, and, this idea that we are, sharing resources and, storing the potential energy across our tribe, across our community to, realize a higher goal. And, then there's the entertainment side. Like it can be fun, it can be taste, it's experiential, right? And, and in the middle, there is this like, so if it was like a Venn diagram, in the middle, it's like this, higher purpose that, food, calls us, or we leverage, as we're called to, transcend our humanity, if you will. And so if I think about it, purely as, well, all of those things coming together on the functional side, it's like a lot of these, the evolution of, our anthropology and our human anthropology. We think about even like technology. It's a beautiful dance of like, how do we get nutrients, more quickly, and in a more sustainable and predictable way, and how do we work together to do that, and how is it reinforced by our social interaction, and the and it's actually enjoyable. And so you start to look at different food processes, like just something as simple as cooking, for example, like the discovery of fire and cooking of meat, for example. So you're in a way, you're kind of wasting some of the food, but you're actually, on the whole, on average, you're making it more accessible. And then, then you might also say, well, now you're introducing carcinogens, right? By the charcoal and the volatile organic compounds, maybe. So that there's many other forms of food processing. You start to think about agriculture. You start to think about the dairy industry. You start to think about food storage practices, which may deplete nutrients. You start to think about the leaching of nutrients from soil because of, different industrialized process. And so, but it's really tempting to kind of vilify, the process. And I've been thinking about it more of late as like more of a systems approach, right? It's like, well, how do we feed the world, right? And how do we feed more people? And if that's the goal, is to get more people food, I think it begs the question, what do we define by food? What do we define by high quality food, right? Because we're seeing like obesity epidemics in North America, for example, and part of that has to do with nutrient depleted food and macronutrient ratios out of sync. And so anyway, I want to hand you that paradigm, and you tell me how it's kind of broken, or how it might work, and then how that relates to kind of what you're doing with the NiME diet trial and what we're seeing in Ireland. So how does that sound as like a jumping off point?
So when you are approaching it from a really big picture, perspective, and in the book, that we have a free science and recipe book of the NiME diet, which are exactly the recipes that were in the clinical trial that we published in Cell. We actually. Yeah. We at least touch on a few things, like community. We actually point out, that in these societies, these non-industrialized societies that inspired us, that community is a huge thing. But obviously, as a scientist, I don't look, I don't do experiments around community. I think it's obviously vastly beneficial, to do things together, to eat. I do put a lot of effort myself now into cooking, so this is just that I'm actually very strict there. I cook every day. And no matter how busy, I am, there is this 1 hour of cooking. But as a scientist, we were really studying diet primarily as a biological, the aspect, of human, seeing, that diet is really achieve things in human biology, human evolution, and what can you actually achieve if you fundamentally change diet, and this is what we were, testing in the human trial. And then the answer of this is, it's traumatic, in terms of, and then what we were probably drawn the most, is prevention of chronic diseases, which are, skyrocketing, and we use markers, that predict cardiovascular disease, but we see even metabolites improve, that would point, towards neuroprotection, for example. And there are aspects, that fascinates me, again, and for me, this is a biological thing. And if you look into, Amerindian tribes in the Bolivian rainforest, for example, like the Sami, I don't know if I pronounced this right. And so this is a tribe in Bolivia, actually eating very similar, that the diet, that we've developed. They have no heart disease, and they have also virtually no Parkinson's. And at least from what we see, obviously I can't make any claim, that we prevented heart disease and Parkinson, but at least from, the markers that change, the metabolites, the, you mentioned carcinogens, we have 3 metabolites that actually point that this diet is substantially less carcinogenic. So this is, it's fun. It's actually foundational how strong these effects are. I think when it comes to the broader aspects that you've discussed is really, and this is something we are increasingly starting to think about, and this is also this partnership now with Gourmet Fuel. But how do we actually make people eat different in society? And this leaves almost my expertise almost completely, and I think that touches along on a lot of the things you mentioned. Community, cooking, a sense of togetherness, all of this. But one of the reasons why I'm so happy and proud of this partnership with Gourmet Fuel is that because I think this is a strategy, that can work in the modern busy world, but it is not a strategy that addresses many of the things you've mentioned, because again, it actually just adds another busy strategy, to get a meal delivered to your door, so it more allows you to adopt this ancestral eating, within a modern, framework, but again, in terms of how we try to make people eat healthier, this leaves my expertise. And then you touched on another really important thing, food processing. I'm in complete agreement, that food processing should not be vilified, in general. We are healthier on average than these communities. We have less malnutrition, all of these things. It's really just that they have a lot less chronic diseases. So I think you need a really nuanced thing, and food processing is not going to go away. So I think this is perhaps another really big society-wide discussion at the moment. And I think some of this discussion, don't know to what degree you followed this, about around these ultra-processed foods probably went into some, not so good directions, because at the end, we will, continue to process foods. A lot of these foods are actually good. And it's really more a discussion around, how can we make, processed foods healthier?
Yeah. Well, and I think it comes back to, so yeah, thank you for that. Well, actually, one of the first things that I'll say just on what you're doing with the NiME food diet and in collaboration with, what was the name of the company again there? And sorry, I just had it at my fingertips.
Gourmet.
Yeah. Right. Gourmet Fuel. Yeah. What I like about the entrepreneurial aspect of this is that like the knowledge translation, it happens almost like instantly, right? And because what you're combining is deep scientific expertise with commercial application. And so, because it's one thing to know what the diet is, but then it's another thing to do it. And it's really hard. It's a skill to cook and assemble in this way. And frankly, to know and not to do is not to know. And I should emphasize, I'm non-expert on the the societal impact and the research. It's really only now that I have a daughter, I have a child, that I'm much more, I guess, let's say, cautious and careful. And I have the benefit of I have a PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry, so I kind of know how the body works and how nutrients and food sources, they literally become us, they literally become our cells. And my wife is a holistic nutritionist, and so together, we have different filters and views, but I think they combine quite nicely. But so coming back on the social cohesion, like, so for example, a few weeks ago was Halloween, right? And so, we want our daughter to know the kids in the neighborhood, and we want to know who our neighbors are. And that's a great opportunity to go around the block. And so it's centered around, getting candy, and that's exciting. And, so, of course we traded at her bag when she got home, and we gave her a bag of, other goodies that were real food, because, as I pulled out the, the different, candies and chocolate bars, and, you might say, oh, well, I ate these when I was a kid and I was fine. It's like, well, actually, no, you didn't, because they're not the same ingredients that they were, 20 years ago. And so I think, like, one of the things to, I don't, again, I'm not an expert at this, but it's a question that I would want to ask and I'd want to study more, is like, to what extent, what is the reason for food processing, right? So, for example, the pasteurization, like, we know what that does. It, kills pathogens, right? But food coloring, what does that do? I think food coloring makes it more fun, right? Oh, wow, look at those colors. That's on the entertainment side, but does it fulfill a function? Like, it might make it's fun, entertaining, and social. So you hit that, but functionally, is it good? And I would say not always. I would say some of those ingredients are toxic. Ultra processed, foods, specifically those with like pure sugar or high fructose corn syrup, like when eaten in, isolation. And, frankly, like, that just kind of lights up that, reptile brain of ours, right? When carbohydrates are there, and, like, evolutionary speaking, those things, before agrarian times, let's say, those were in short supply, they were seasonal. And so when they were there, like, oh my God, like, right. So that's why they caused such a, an amazing response. And, coming back from, like, the athlete's point of view, there's a whole approach to, carbo loading, right? So it's like you deplete the system entirely of carbohydrates and therefore glycogen. And then when those are reintroduced, you get this, like, super compensation, right? And so endurance athletes know this, and they have this incredible, like, energy store for the competition. Now, and interestingly, it's like the same practices are kind of applied to the beef industry, right? So, it's like, right before the beef slaughter, it's like, here's all this grain, here's all this sugar. And so actually in the beef itself, it's, yes, there's protein, but there's glycogen storage there as well. So there's a lot of sugar and there's a lot of water in the beef. And so, well, what does that do? Is like, well, it increases the volume and it increases the yield, but it is not increasing the quality of, let's say, protein or beef. And so I think it's, getting a little more material and objective around how are these food processing practices, like, are they really, good for, people in this holistic.
Let me come in here, because I'm only reading around this a little bit, around the fringes, with processed food, because I follow the literature a little bit, and I'm actually at the moment reading, in defense of food from Michael Pollan and stuff like this. I think this is a purely economic, thing. This is, these food companies are not trying to be evil. They sell us what we want to eat, and that comes, a bit to what you've said. Even Hadza hunter gatherers, they prefer honey that they get, I think, 1 month a year, and they prefer the meat. So they have exactly the same preference. They still eat 75% plants in the end, but that's out of necessity. So we don't have this necessity anymore. The food companies, obviously they capitalize on our evolutionary, preferences, but at the end they want to make money. The food colors that you mentioned, this is just marketing. These foods are prettier. They are marketed to kids. I'm not saying this is good. Some of it is pretty shady, but it is still at the end, what we are buying. And then there are some very strong statements, that in a capitalistic food system, that it's almost impossible to produce healthy foods. There is simply, the incentives are stacked against it. And again, I'm not even blaming the food companies here primarily. It's also the individuals. It's no matter in the food industry, no matter who you talk with, no matter how healthy food is, not that people don't care about food or about health or something, but the thing is, everybody will tell you if and again, I talk with some of these people, if this food is just 3 or 5 cents more expensive than the other food, it's just not going to be viable. So they always tell even if so that the health might be some added benefit, but at the end it still has to be. It's still purely driven, by economics. And I do think that this economics in combination with a dysfunctional regulatory environment, I think that is the problem why our food is so unhealthy.
Right. Well, and the other thing that we didn't talk about is, there are drivers outside of the food industry, right? And, that is like how people, like you mentioned that you now have a practice of cooking every day. Well, not everybody has that. And so then there's the, the variable of convenience, right? And you've got busy families, usually if they have
hugely important.
Yeah, both of them are working, and you've got extracurricular activities, maybe, not to mention, depends where you are on, socioeconomic status. And so like a lot of these foods that are cheap in education, so you're going to know. And so I'd like to know like how like the NiME diet is solving it can't solve all of those problems, but it certainly looks like it's solving the problem of nutritional quality. It's probably not cheaper. But you can tell me if I'm wrong, and but then there is
I love this conversation because when you touch on all the important things, that about, and so now I have to be very honest. We haven't thought about this much, as from a economic, commercial feasibility, sustainability aspect. Because in the day when we developed NiME, we really just wanted to do, essentially, what we thought is a more ancestral diet. That was the motivation. But then we are also poor scientists, and we wanted to run an entire human trial. So to some degree, this diet had to be really economical, simply just because we had to be able to afford it. So now, again, I've never done an analysis about, how economic it is, but I can tell you when we started collaborating with Gourmet Fuel and they took on our recipes one-to-one, they actually commented and complimented us that they said this is really competitive. And Gourmet Fuel, are on the market. I mean, they're not cheap, but they're still not premium, So they actually said it was very, very easy to produce these meals, while still being kind of economically. And again, it probably has something to do with because we simply just couldn't afford more, and all credit goes to Anissa Ahmed, the dietitian and nutritionist that developed these, So So I do think NiME is very cost effective, and when I cook it myself, it's definitely cheaper than much of the other stuff that I'm cooking. I always cook healthy, but NiME dishes are on the cheaper end, yeah. But and we were actually starting to think to start analyzing this more, and also perhaps developing some budget, options and budget recipes and stuff. And this is something we might be doing over the next 2, 3, 4 months. So we started thinking about this. But overall, I do think NiME is quite an affordable diet.
Mm-hmm. And it's exclusively in Ireland right now, right?
I mean, obviously the recipes are free everywhere in the world for download, yeah. But at the moment, our commercial activities are Gumi Fuel is only operating in Ireland.
Yeah. So I like what you said about, you were researchers and you had budgetary constraints, and that's that. So I like to, think of this as like a systems approach, right? And so if you constrain the system, or you impose an outcome on the system, let's say, what happens is these emergent properties, they present themselves not necessarily by design, or actually, in fact, yes, very much by design, but not intention, let's say.
Yeah,
So
there
it's
was
like,
no intention to make a poor diet or a cheap diet.
right,
It was really
right.
just,
Yeah.
really just, we can't really go for shrimps. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So where it's going with this is like, so say, for example, I should say I'm operating outside of my zone of expertise. And so I'm just using examples and analogy, but, say, for example, the education system, if your goal, for example, you're not seeing as many graduates and you impose on, high schools, like, we got to get more graduates. A simple way to do that is just lower the standard, right? And, the same, thing, the same. So what are the emergent properties of that is, the emergent properties are, kids effectively, they develop this potentially like cognitive dissonance over time because, hey, you didn't master your fractions in grade 4. Well, realize that in grade 8, are we going to make you go back to grade 4? It's like, no, we're going to help you get through, and somehow with that, weakness, and maybe that's the better option, right? Is to produce more graduates who are weaker than less graduates who are stronger on the whole. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to have an objective conversation on emergent properties from systems. And what I'm hearing from you is like, one of the things that was imposed on the NiME diet was obviously it had to be standardized, right? In terms of the nutrition that's there, because there's so many variables in doing any kind of dietary research, but then it did have to fall within budgetary constraints. So it kind of sounds like, what you did by design or as an emergent properties, you kind of found the balance to optimize high nutrient density, high nutrient quality, void of, industrial contaminants, let's say, that cause ill health. And while, trying to not make it too expensive for the purposes of just being able to run the study. And that sounds like actually like a very neat solution to people who, want healthier food, don't know how to choose it because frankly they don't have a PhD in this, and what's available is not necessarily what's most helpful. So it's like you're making it accessible, available, and to an extent within a specific price range. And then I like this idea that, well, you can add tiers to it, right? So you can say, okay, look, generally speaking, this is what the NiME diet is, and it's like, hey, here's the basic plan. And then if you're one of those people that wants like the ultra pure organic grass fed, okay, well, that's now like the next level. And I don't know if your research necessarily discerned between the differences
No,
layer of granularity, right? Okay, so but
I'm not even 100% sure that a lot of this has a strong nutritional basis, but that we would have. This is a different discussion. Yeah.
So that's its own marketing, right? Is like that's kind of going the other way. It's like, hey, look at all this food that's poison, and actually get this ultra expensive organic. Now, that's not to say that like.
And then I would like to add something. We also wanted to have something practical. You said, as much as we kind of got inspired by non-industrialized eating, there is still canned foods in our diet, so that, because we had to be practical. It is a modern diet in an industrial setting, inspired by non-industrial eating, so the beans are coming from cans, the artichokes are coming from cans, some processed foods frameworks, these are even processed foods, level 3. I don't agree with that, because I don't think, simply just from a perspective how they are altered through processing, I still consider them minimal process. But again, look, these are all nuances, but it was really important for us, that we are generating a diet that, is just practical, payable, and still, healthy from a nutritional perspective. There is good evidence in the nutrition field, that frozen peas and canned vegetables are still quite good for you, especially if you compare this through these, vastly, ultra processed or industrialized foods.
Yeah. Well, and so this comes back to like the function as well, right? So like astronauts, they have to have packaged and stored foods, right? And that's legacy from soldiers going off to war, right? And a lot of those RDAs that we are living from today is, thanks to, those soldiers, right? Is because they would experience things like rickets and scurvy and beriberi, right? Like here's what it looks like to be nutrient depleted, because those foods that were processed weren't complete foods, and so for months and years without complete food sources, you see the strain of chronic disease, present itself. And so, okay, I the funny thing is your expertise is in microflora, microbiome. We haven't talked about any microbial stuff at all.
We've only talked about things I actually don't know much.
That's funny, right? And but you can see the impact of the work that you're doing, because it is based on, like, well, we talk a lot about systems, right? And so why don't we talk a little bit more about ecosystems and the microbial ecosystems, right? Because there are so many emergent properties there, right? In terms of our, gut, brain health, for example, chronic disease, as, it may be, measured or predicted by biomarkers in the gut. There's a lot of, that research that's in commercialization of those, tests that are available. But maybe let's spend like a little bit of time on like microbial synergies in general. So I remember going to Woods Hole, and they got the marine biological labs there, right, in Massachusetts, and they had a microbial diversity course there that was just amazing. And
one of my PhD students in the day did that too, and it transformed our work in the lab too.
And that blew my mind. Like, I mean, I already had my mind blown because I was in Ford Doolittle's lab, and he was a really master of the thought experiment and deconstructing Darwin's tree of life. And actually, I remember one of the first things Ford said about me, this is how he captured my mind, is I took his genes and genomes class, and he said something like, I'm going to challenge you to rethink how you think about the selective advantage or the nature of a gene that makes it selectively advantageous, and not so much on its like function, your eye color or enzymatic capacity or capability. Sure, those things are important, but ultimately the ultimate function is, so that gene can be transferred to the next generation, right? But that's really kind of Richard Dawkins type stuff. And I don't, my view has evolved a lot since then. Like, I mean, yes, I think genes are cool, and they maybe are they the as the reductionist, are they as small a scale as you can go down? Well, of course, it depends on how you define a gene, so, but let's not go there. But I really do also like, I don't know if I call it the other end of the spectrum, but I don't see a competing view, more of a complementary type of view from Stephen Jay Gould, which is more of like an organismal, kind of an argument. So it's not just the single gene, but it, there's the emergent properties of the organism itself, various structures, et cetera, and various processes, even like, things like the epigenetics. We're learning more and more that there's this reemergence of, the Lamarckian philosophy of evolution, that is, acquired characteristics are passed down. See, now I'm just talking about a single organism or a single cell, where I think the beauty in the work that you're doing is, well, you're talking about consortia and communities of organisms that, are really, I mean, to the layperson who doesn't, get to experience this, it's mind blowing. And I guess, so here, I'll set it up like this, and I'll say that, this is cliche, it, but it's a good jumping off point. There's more bacterial cells in us and on us than there are human cells. And so you might, entertain the idea that we're just kind of these walking incubators, right? And there's all of this, biochemical crosstalk that's happening between our own cells, the mitochondria that give us energy, transcription of our own genome based on the molecules that bacteria, are making. And so maybe we could, poke around with that a little bit. Like, how do you define ecosystem? When you think about ecosystem, like classifiers, like you're not necessarily trying to, well, maybe you are trying to move one specific keystone player in the community, but it's not even necessarily, I'm not trying to ask you, how do we control our microbiomes? And really, just from your expertise, somebody who thinks about this every day, why don't we just talk about, microbial ecosystems in the context of how they affect our lives, as humans, but also like even geologically as well. So that's a big question, and feel free to jump off wherever makes sense.
It's very big, yeah,
Sure.
but I do think I can come in there. So when I think about microbiomes, I come at this really from an ecological angle, So I think what inspired me the most is actually basic ecology, ecological theory, and virtually nothing of this ecological theory came really neither from the microbiome field and also not the microbiology field. So the really pioneering work there is really coming more from plant ecology, macroecology, and stuff. Yeah. And in this world with ecology, communities, ecosystems, it's that in ecology, I think by definition is, an understanding of the, interactions between members of a community and then its environment and the processes that then shape their function, but also their, distribution, in these actual ecosystems. And this is what I say. And that's just to come back, to your discussion around genes, and what is the, unit, that is the all of these units are important in biology: genes, organisms, skills, but what interests me the most is I'm probably more a bit on the organismal view, as much as I think, certain, and then it depends on the gene also, how much focus is really this, selfish gene, but I think especially from an ecological perspective and evolutionary perspective, I think it is the organism, but then there are different levels of selection, or different hierarchies on which selection can act.
Right.
And actually, some of this is even I learned in actually publications from Ruth Ley, that the selection and they act together. It's not about, one is more important than the other. If you think about microbiomes, then all of these organisms within these communities, they interact with each other. They are synergistic. They have networks between, but they also compete within these ecosystems. That this is an entire world in itself on which selection acts, and then these communities are within a host. They are part of a symbiosis, and their selection actually acts on the host. And there's very, very strong evidence. So I do like the idea of a holobiont, as a meaning that mammals, are really, as an again, then unit within their own communities. We evolved, within, networks, with other mammals, within these ecosystems, but within this, there you have selections on the host and you have selection on the microbiome, and then you have very, very complex systems by which this symbiosis can actually work and by which mutualism can arise. And this is a really important thing, because this at the end, has to become somehow mutualistic, meaning beneficial to both partners. And it's clearly the case, microbiomes are, important for us and we are beneficial for them. So I think this is probably my kind of hierarchical thinking when I think about microbiomes. And it's a really important one for me because to some degree, I think these interactions, as they have evolved, are now disrupted, in modern societies, because,
Right.
because of the environmental shifts that we've done, which then again, brings me to the key motivation of my research and even the key motivations that inspired NiME.
Got it. Yeah, there's a lot there, and I well, let's talk about your current research. So I know that NiME is out there. What is your current research program, and what's kind of got you heads down, and what's your team working on today, and how does the NiME diet trial potentially evolve, or what's the next NiME that you're working on?
So at the moment we are almost, it's a direct continuation of the research on NiME. So we are interested in microbiome restoration. We are interested to restore or redress some of these alterations that we see in non-industrialized microbiomes, just that we are doing it with different strategies. So actually I have an entire program around processed foods, trying to make processed foods healthier with dietary fiber, also just from the get-go, not going more natural or something, so just being more realistic, what you can perhaps achieve. We are interested in, reintroduction of some of these lost species, using symbiotic approaches. And we are also functionally characterizing some lost species, because I think we mentioned, that some species, in the industrialized world, the microbiome is less diverse. Some of these species are essentially either gone or they are at least much, much less prevalent, so we are starting to think about what they actually do, specifically to the immune system. In terms of NiME, we are in the process of writing grants, to kind of, continue with this work. And there we want to go into kind of different directions, also understand the diet better mechanistically in what it does, but then also applications, so I am starting to get very interested, in trying, to bring it more into a reality, essentially. So, but this is at the stage of grant writing at the moment. So there isn't really anything ongoing. Yeah.
Got it.
And tomorrow I give a presentation to 5-year-olds on the marina market. So this is another thing, because with our knowledge mobilization campaign, so in January, when the Cell paper came, I made this decision that I said, look, I really want this message to be out. And I don't know if I knew what I was getting myself into, but I probably spent around 25% of my time actually, communicating the benefits of this diet, to the public.
Well, I mean, that really kind of leads us to what we discussed at the beginning, which is, those 3 questions I mentioned I'd finish with, which is, number one, if this was your last podcast, what is the key takeaway that you'd like to share? Number 2 is, who needs to hear it? And then the third question is who would you recommend as the next guest for me to host on the DNA of Things?
So the first thing is the key message that I tell this everyone is eat healthy. I think, I know this sounds, kind of, cliche or something like this. But what I've learned with this research is, everybody knows we should eat healthy. Everybody knows, that if you, eat completely unhealthy, that your health degrades. But what I think I've underestimated is how much you can achieve with healthy eating. And, I'm in this research, if you look at, diet, as studies, that go into the actual extremes, societies that really stick to Mediterranean diet. If you look again at these, these Amerindians communities without heart disease, and I know that you can't 100%, pin this down to diet, but I do think diet is a huge component of this. Yeah. For example, looking with the work that I'm doing, so I found out, for example, that the life expectancy in Germany is now 3 years shorter than in Spain, for example. And I've had so many discussions around this. Cardiologists, looking at German cardiovascular system versus in Spain, and saying, that it's basically a mess in Germany. While if you look at the Spanish cardiovascular system, at least on average, they are much, much healthier. So they're in the recent nutrition literature, the pretty much the take-home message is, with a healthier diet. And our own data supports this, at least on the level of markers. We only have markers because it's a 3-week study, but it does support it. But you can essentially extend your life expectancy by 10 years, and you probably can extend your healthy life expectancy, also where you don't have, any chronic diseases, by probably even more than 10 lives. So I think this is the number one message: is you can get substantial, or you can, prevent disease and stay healthier substantially longer, and the effects are massive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so who needs to hear this the most? Where do you think it's going to have the most impact?
This was probably your hardest question that you sent me, and I thought, wow, who would it want? But I think we touched a little bit on food systems. We touched a little bit on incentives, on economics. I think at the moment there is virtually no viable system by which we make societies healthier. All the incentives, at least as a researcher, it feels like they are stacked against us. The economics, our own biology, the socio-economic thing. So it's really, really daunting. And if you look at the success stories in, trying to make, I just said how important I think healthy eating is. But if you look at the success stories where we successfully move societies, into a healthier state, that is very, very short, this list of success stories. But there are a few. And one, for example, is a nutrition program that Finland ran, somewhere in the 60s, to reduce their high level of heart disease. And that really worked. And that worked because it was a top-down approach. It was politics, doing a systematically revamping of their food system. So if you now ask me who should hear what I say, then it is essentially a politician or a really rich person. I would love to convince a billionaire, lots of billionaires do good work. They do, Bill Gates, goes into the third world, to improve lives there. So I would wish one of them would actually say, hey, we should really make, people eat healthier. Yeah. To some degree, Kennedy, the new guy, is actually, to some degree, what he's trying to do is actually good. The problem is just that then he's so non-scientific about everything, that it kind of goes down the drain. But I do think, if I would want to reach somebody, it's really somebody who has the means, to actually politically make changes.
Okay. Let's see what we can do to amplify the message. See if we can get it into Elon Musk and, have him think about who he's going to be feeding on Mars and how he's going to be doing that. How about we start with Earth first? Okay. And then the last question is who would you recommend as my next guest?
So that is another really difficult question. Obviously, there's lots of scientists, that I really like, but the name that actually kind of popped in my head was, so I ran into a guy at 2 conferences now called Kieran Ford. So he's in Wageningen, and he is kind of a sensory food science guy, and he works a lot on processed foods, and how processing and food characteristics influence how we eat. And he has a really, really interesting program called Restructure, where they, completely, look at the actual structure of processed foods, and how that influences health. I disagree with him a lot, because he would be a person, he's very critical about, the framework around ultra processed foods, and he doesn't think it's scientific and stuff. And although I have very little scientific disagreements with him, I think we have kind of disagreements, on the role of, this framework, in communication and stuff. But I always enjoy him. I think he is, no matter how much we disagree, I'm always impressed, by what he has to say and the work he's doing. So that is probably, if you have an interest in processed foods, ultra processed foods, this entire framework, how food processing influences health, how you can make benefits while still being, he's much more pragmatic than me. I'm probably more of an idealist. For example, he joked all the time, oh yeah, NiME is awesome, but is really anyone going to eat it, but then he still invited me to his conference, to talk about processed food. So he's also very open-minded, so it would be
how do you spell his name?
He's Irish. So something like C. You know how the Irish don't spell names like normal people. So it's Kiriam. I can send you his email and name if you're interested to talk about processed foods in a societal sense. He is your man, I think.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'll definitely follow up with you on the contact info there. So, well, hey, Dr. Walter, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your insights and sharing your passion and trusting me to spread your word, your good news, and for spending the time today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, and I can tell there's more conversations for us to have in the future.
Thank you very much for having me. That was very, very interesting, very inspirational. Yeah, so appreciate. Thank you.
Dr. Walter has given us the scientific blueprint for a future worth building. That is a healthy society built on a balanced microbiome. The data is undeniable from his research, demonstrating that the effects of eating well are massive. Now the responsibility falls on us to carry the vision forward. So whether through pragmatic plate protocol in our own homes or through advocacy for top-down change, the time for passivity is over. A real vision here put forward to now bring to your kitchen table. And so are you up for this? Are you up for the movement to reclaim 10 healthy years and to spread this good news to those who need to hear it?